The Weeknd has been putting satanic and occultic messages in his music and music videos for years and years, which begs the question why and what's the agenda? So for those unfamiliar, The Weeknd is a really popular hip hop and pop recording artist who really took off in 2011 when he released his first ever project titled House of Balloons. The trilogy of mixtapes that he released for House of Balloons ended up being one of the most popular mixtape series during that period of time. There's an estimate out that about 8 million downloads happened during that period for those three projects that came out. These projects got the attention of Toronto big name Drake, and essentially The Weeknd's career took off from about 2011 to 2012. He was touring, doing festivals, and really blowing his music up. During that period of time when he was ramping up, this is what really set him up for success in the music industry. The Weeknd, being a native to Toronto, he was able to get the attention of Drake, like I mentioned with that mixtape trilogy, and ended up working very closely with Drake, and in fact being featured on and being a songwriter for 4 different songs off of Drake's Take Care album. If you're familiar with that album, that was a really big album for Drake as well, and kind of a defining moment in his career as well. So at that point, The Weeknd had really gotten the attention that he wanted and was able to navigate the music industry and start his path into stardom. During this time in 2012, The Weeknd inked his first ever big record deal with Republic Records, and he did it in a way that he had an imprint for his own label called XO. And when you have an imprint with a larger label, usually that's a really good sign the label trusts you, trusts your ear, your message, your vision, and the direction that you want to take your music. Because in a way, they're giving you your own space to create and giving you the freedom to bring in other people and your own team to do so. For anyone that's familiar with the music industry, this is a pretty big deal, right? To be able to sign to a major label and also have your own imprint so you can create the sound that you really want to create and not necessarily have as many restrictions as other artists on the label. If you haven't already, watch my other video entitled Why Music Industry Creates Modern Day Slaves to give some context around this. But this was a pretty big deal at that time, and still, if it happens today, is a huge deal. The label really demonstrating a level of trust and a level of commitment. But of course, that always comes with strings. Now, before we dive into the satanic agenda that I'm talking about, or the occultic sounds and messages that are in his music, I want to keep in mind that leading up to this mixtape trilogy had a ton of graphic sexual imagery, drug use, explicit language. I mean, really, really explicit content as it was. And obviously The Weeknd, being a great recording artist, was able to put this out and do really well despite all these things. And honestly, there's even some hints of occultic and satanic themes and messages in those earlier projects as well. And while I do think they're setting the stage in a way, I won't dive into those projects specifically. What I'm going to be talking about in this video, this part 1, is going to be his debut project on Republic Records and his sophomore album. So as we kind of go into it, just keep that in mind. I might reference some of the older songs from the trilogy, but overall I want to look at his first 2 mainstream projects because that's really what moved him from being an exciting upcoming star into an actual rising star and leading into superstardom. So before I jump into the main content, I also kind of want to just throw out what typically happens when an artist signs with a big record label. Usually they go through this process of initiation where essentially the record label kind of steps in and takes over their image, their branding, how they sound, their music, and either amplifies it and injects it with, hyperfuel, or totally recreates them. And in this case, The Weeknd was kind of injected with hyperfuel, if you will. So they took him, they brought him in, and essentially just sent him on his way with everything that he needed to be successful. This doesn't happen too often, but it's interesting that it happened with him because his music being so sexually graphic, his drug use, and everything that he talks about really fit the agenda that people in those record labels and those elites were trying to push in the first place. So they didn't need to recreate him or take him to a different place. A good example of an artist getting recreated might be Black Eyed Peas, for example. They came out with this kind of positive message, if you remember, very organic sound, very strong in the instrumentation, and over the course of their albums molded into this techno, pop, rap, new age white people music, for lack of a better term. I hope that's not offensive. But really The Weeknd kind of stayed true to what he was and was just injected with hyperfuel. But there's still an initiation process that happens, and it happens with every artist. So when you sign with a label, whether you know it or not, the elites of that label, they have an agenda, they have something they want to push. And as soon as you step into that label, you're either going to be coerced into it, You're going to willingly go along with it and be a puppet, or you won't, and you'll kind of be put to the shelf or not be able to move forward with your career. So for me, when I look at The Weeknd's career and his trajectory, I immediately think that he was either coerced or that he was willingly and knowingly stepping into this relationship, regardless of the consequences. And as we look into some of the music video themes that he has later on, it's very possible that he entered into this agreement and then realized it was bad and wanted to get out, but was unable to do so. Where I think this genesis kind of happened is on his third project of House of Balloons called Echoes of Silence, where he released a song called Initiation. And if you listen to the song Initiation, it is incredibly graphic, like most of his stuff, but it really takes this path of a young girl who wants to be a part of his group, who's essentially drugged. She was forced to go to these parties. They were taking multiple drugs, mixing drugs. She was sleeping with The Weeknd in this song. He talks about sleeping with her. And then he also talks about his friends stepping in and sleeping with her as well, essentially running a train. I know that gets kind of graphic, and I'm sorry to put that imagery out there, but that is what's in the song. That's what Initiation is really all about. And in a lot of ways, that's exactly what happens to these artists. They come in, they get the glitz, the glamour, the high of fame, and then they're pretty much get taken advantage of in that same way. And I'm not saying that The Weeknd was taken advantage of in a sexual way. It's not what I mean. But what I'm saying is they get taken advantage of as people, as living, breathing people with individual thoughts and identities. I think that's essentially what he was talking about. And even in the outro of that song, he says, up north, up north, up north, OVO and XO. So whether he was aware of it or not at the time, his mindset around this initiation process was kind of coming through on his final project. And keep in mind that final project was the last project before he signed with the record label. And even when he signed with the record label, they re-released a lot of those songs and projects under their label. So kind of an interesting little dialogue happening there. Whether it's completely tied in, I'm not sure. But that song Initiation really caught my attention because the process that he takes this girl through on the song is the same process that almost every artist who blows up gets taken through. When I talk about an artist having an agenda being pushed through them or being a puppet, what I really mean is that the elites at the label, the people at the label, are manipulating these artists to push a message. Whether that message is sexual immorality, whether that's to push the idea of a political narrative, there is an agenda with the music that they're releasing. And in the same way that a Christian artist like myself might come out with music that's pointing people to the gospel and pointing them to Christ, I do that not only because I know I'm doing it, but also because it's an outpouring of my creativity. So in that same way, when I look at an artist like The Weeknd, that's kind of what I'm thinking is they either know or they don't know, but the fact is it's coming out because someone is pushing it, whether it's the artist or not. And just to be clear, I don't know The Weeknd's intentions. I don't know if he's a willing participant of this. All I know is what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, what I'm hearing. And again, in the past, like I've said, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, I'm going to call it a duck. So all the respect in the world to The Weeknd. I'm not going to judge him on a personal level or his character. I'm just going to look at the music and dissect it for what it is. With all that said, let's dive into his first ever project on Republic Records called Kiss Land. So Kiss Land is the debut album of The Weeknd off of Republic Records. This is a very separate project from his trilogy of mixtapes, even though they were re-released. Kiss Land is really the first step for The Weeknd coming into the mainstream as an artist, whereas before he was kind of this underground sensation known across the world under this alias, never really showing his face. Kiss Land is kind of that movement to the public in a major way. The album itself was supported by 6 singles, and I want to name off those singles and dissect a couple of them, but also keep in mind and notice the names. So the first single, Kiss Land, obviously the name of the project, Belong to the World, which has a very deep meaning that we're going to dive into. Love in the Sky, which has a very interesting concept as well. Live For and Wanderlust. Now again, I'm not trying to read too deep into these names because obviously these names could be anything, but as we dive into some of the song content here, I want to point out some of the themes that are coming up over and over and are very characteristic of the style of music that he creates. A couple things you always notice about these albums when they come out and they're pushing this new artist or getting people excited about this new artist is the album will always be critically acclaimed. The critics will always love the album when it comes out, and this album was definitely critically acclaimed as well. They'll usually have a decent first week of sales. In this case, he did 100K in his first week, which is not great. It's not, chart busting, but still really solid for the artist that he was at that time. Keep in mind, this is his first album under a major label. Now, The Weeknd himself, when describing this album, had a very interesting kind of dialogue about it, which caught my attention and I think kind of speaks to this beginning or this genesis of this satanic and occultic like imagery and message that's hidden. So I'll kind of read through this and put it up on the screen as well. Kiss Land symbolizes the tour life, but it's a world that I created in my head. When I think about Kiss Land, I think about a terrifying place. It's a place I've never been before that I'm very unfamiliar with. I don't know who I am right now, and I'm doing all these outlandish things in these settings that I'm not familiar with. To me, it's the most terrifying thing ever. So when you hear the screams on the record, and you hear all those horror references and you feel scared, listen to the music because I want you to feel what I'm feeling. Kiss Land is like a horror movie. So with that context, as we dive into this, keep that in mind. The way that he kind of sees this album and sees this project is like a horror movie. The way that he describes it is Kiss Land is like a new fantasy. It's like a new world that he's stepping into, because for 21 years until he signed his first label, he had been in the same place, in the same house. And after that, he had been touring all over the world and experienced so much at once. So that was kind of his, I don't know, way to contextualize that. But a horror movie, screams on the album. I mean, you know, let's just back up here. There's a way you could tell a story without, I don't know, that kind of use of imagery or use of media. And, you know, maybe I'm just not that creative, right? But I think that gives a good context to everything as we looked at some of these lyrics. So generally across the board, not that this is that occultic or satanic in and of itself, but all of the singles that he released had very graphic sexual covers for them, and some of them, in some cases, for the music videos, were even too graphic for television and couldn't be shown without a not safe for work sign. So just keep that in mind, right? At the very basis, this is music nobody should be really listening to, especially not young kids and especially not Christians. But let's talk about that first single that came off the album, which was called Kiss Land. It's the album title. So the song itself, Kiss Land, is very sexual, obviously, and he talks about doing sexual acts with the fan and goes so far to say if she comes backstage to only take pictures, then she needs to leave, right? Which, I mean, pretty much he's saying, if you come backstage, you're gonna sleep with me. I mean, women are only objects. They're only there to be used. They're only there for his gain and his pleasure, and they're meant to be discarded, which to me is a common problem with young adults and young men in life across the country. This idea that women are only objects and should be discarded. On top of that, multiple times throughout the song, he talks about how his kisses aren't free, how she has to pay with her body, and he doesn't want to hear her talk, only her body talk. So again, very sexually explicit, but also this objectification of women that is running rampant through our world. When you have sites like OnlyFans, where girls are essentially turned into objects and their body is made to be a source of income, you wonder where it stems from in some cases. But then when music like this is the norm, or this is music that women and young girls are digesting daily, what kind of message is that really putting into their head about their value, their self-worth, and what they need to do to get the attention of a man they like? On the third verse, The Weeknd makes some pretty profound comments as well. And kind of to call back earlier in the video where I talked about how he had been 21 years in the same place and then hit the world touring in 12 months, this is that exact lyric actually. So let me read this through. I went from staring at the same four walls for 21 years to seeing the whole world in 12 months. Been gone for so long, I think I might have just found God. Right after that, he talks about it. Probably not. If his friends keep bringing these girls, if he keeps living this life, probably not. He's never going to be able to get out of it. So the whole song, he talks about excessive drug use, sex, and treating women as objects, but he thinks that he found God? How exactly does this add up? So when we think about this just from a general setting, awful. But if we look at a Christian context, what does the Bible say about the worth of women? Proverbs 31:10. An excellent wife who can find? She is more precious than jewels. Also Psalm 139:14. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it well. So obviously from a biblical standpoint, women are not objects to be discarded. That should be clear enough. But even on the flip side of it, when you look at just how he's talking, would you want your daughter, your mother, your wife to ever be talked about that way or treated that way? Or the idea that if you sleep with enough women, you might find God as well? Because all this is very contrary. On Genius.com, one of the annotations that somebody filled out made a comment on that same lyric, and it stuck out to me as being really profound as well, because this is a secular source, I'm assuming, not someone who's coming from a Christian worldview. But check out what they say about this particular lyric. What's interesting about the dropped E in his stage name is that even though it's pronounced The Weeknd, phonetically speaking, it can also be pronounced as The Weekend, a double entendre for the wild hedonistic rush of the partying and the booze, the drugs and sex and the clubbing. Then also touching about the overindulgence of these things takes a big toll on you, and over time with dire consequences and negative after effects on your life and relationships. So yeah, I mean, if you go through this and kind of, I'm scrolling through the rest of this quote here, but yeah, what a powerful thought that The Weeknd phonetically could be The Weekend, which is really what a state that he's currently in on this song and a lot of his music. He's been weakened by the world, he's been weakened by drugs, sex, alcohol, and again, this hedonistic lifestyle. So when we look again at how he should be treating people, to me, while it's not blatantly satanic in and of itself, it sets the tone for a standard in life and in his music that is everything that the enemy wants you to believe. Again, for this Kiss Land project, to me, it's the one that has the least satanic and occultic themes, but I think they're starting to take root here. And when you look at his sophomore album in comparison, I mean, the difference is night and day. But for this particular song, the following single that he released right after Kiss Land was Belong to the World. And for this particular song, it has the same hypersexual cover and themes, but the lyrics are very, very profound to me from that occultic and satanic standpoint. And I kind of want to dive into this a little bit more. So this song in particular is about a girl that he's in love with that he shouldn't be in love with, and that's kind of how he framed it. It's falling in love with the wrong person. But let's look at who exactly he's falling in love with. And at the beginning, there were some interesting lines, I think that were in Japanese. I didn't actually check this, but I believe they were in Japanese. And here's what those lines say. Too bad if you forget about me, I'll have to live with it. We swear by God we will be together forever. Now I'm worried God will take your soul because you broke your promise. Now in Christianity, God taking your soul is actually a positive thing. So what is he talking about, kind of framing it as a negative thing? God's going to take your soul because you broke this promise? Kind of an interesting twist on things. And if you go through the song, the lyrics really allude to this girl or this person that he's in love with being just like him, and that he shouldn't love her, but he still does anyway. And at the conclusion of the song, he doesn't leave this girl. The song doesn't end with him walking away. The song kind of leaves it in suspense, almost as if to say he's still there, even though he shouldn't be. So let's go through some of the lyrics and check that out. On the pre-chorus, he goes on to say, I'm not a fool, I just love that you're dead inside. I'm not a fool, I'm just lifeless too, but you taught me how to feel when nobody ever would, and you taught me how to love when no one ever could. He then goes into the chorus and says, ooh girl, I know I should leave you and learn to mistreat you because you belong to the world. And ooh girl, I want to embrace you, domesticate you, but you belong to the world. You belong to the world. So he talks about he's falling in love with the wrong person, but could it be deeper than that? Absolutely, and I think that it is. And because of the way that he's kind of framing it, saying God's going to take your soul, I don't know, it kind of speaks to a couple things, but biblically I want to point out one thing. In the Bible, whenever a harlot is mentioned, specifically in like a metaphoric context, it's talking about a church or a nation or a people that have turned their back on God, have turned away from God. In Isaiah 121, the prophet says, how the faithful city has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. And multiple times throughout the Bible, you see this idea of a prostitute or a harlot being a nation that has essentially turned their love from God and turned it to other gods like a harlot would, taking their love and moving it away. So over and over, The Weeknd says that he's falling for this woman who's dead inside just like him. She's wrong for him, belongs to the world, and yet and still he pursues her. It sounds to me like The Weeknd is out chasing after who he knows to be the wrong woman. His love is burning for her, and even though we know he should leave her, he never actually does. At the end of the second verse, he ends it by saying, and this ain't right, you've been the only one to make me smile in so long, I've succumbed to what I've become, oh baby. That to me really speaks to him embracing his fallen state. That's saying, okay, I know I shouldn't be here, I know I shouldn't love you, I know I shouldn't be in this relationship, but I've embraced it and I've succumbed to this sin or to this desire that I know is wrong in my heart and still pursues it. The music video tells a very similar story. At the beginning of the video, he's kind of in a trance-like state. These two hands come out and touch his head, and then he hears this Japanese voice, which is not his own, but a third person telling him, you know, this idea about God put you in my life, and I'm afraid he's going to take your soul because you've broken this promise to me, which is again very strange. And throughout the music video, he's seeing pictures of this woman who he's pursuing, along with this very large group of men who are all dressed the same. At the end of the music video, he sees her on stage, dressed in white, very white skin, glorified in a way with a lot of light shining on her, performing on a stage with all of these guys that kind of look, from a dress standpoint, look the same as The Weeknd, looking to her and worshiping her, for lack of a better words, really. And The Weeknd singing the song "You Belong to the World," right? And around her on the stage are these other men with white skin, dressed in white, doing the exact same thing. Very, very symbolic to me of that biblical imagery where we see a harlot being synonymous with a church or a nation who's turned their back on God and gone after other gods. So The Weeknd saying "You belong to the world and I've succumbed to what I've become" is him embracing his fallen state and really loving and worshiping this thing that he knows is wrong for him. So while Kiss Land definitely ramped up those dark themes and those dark tones and those sexually explicit themes, as most of his music does, his sophomore album really ramps it up all the way to 10. And even his subsequent albums after that do the same thing. So Beauty Behind the Madness is really the album that took The Weeknd from a star into being a superstar. For a lot of reasons, but a few in particular. One, it was a critically acclaimed album. You know, obviously, like I said before, the critics are really owned by these industries and these record labels and these elites. So, of course, the album's going to be critically acclaimed, even if it talks about treating women like objects, right? Which is what Hollywood is opposed to, or this Me Too movement is spoke out against. But it's okay for him, right? Anyways, man, I don't want to sidetrack too much. But also, his song was featured in 50 Shades of Grey, being the main theme song for that movie, which again was a very sexually explicit movie about BDSM, I believe. I'm not sure. And then also featured in The Hunger Games as well, being one of the theme songs for one of the Hunger Game movies. And those movies are obviously very huge. Again, that movie itself filled with very Gnostic themes. So the idea that a hypersexual movie and a very Gnostic movie are featuring his music, this isn't by mistake, right? It's all tied into the same kind of movement, or the same kind of media beast, if you will. The album also featured appearances from Kanye West, Ed Sheeran, Lana Del Rey, a lot of producers, really prominent producers as well. This album really had a huge push behind it when compared to Kiss Land, where it was kind of his entry-level album to get the ball rolling. His sophomore album was really where they pulled all the stops to kind of launch him into superstardom. The most standout thing about this album when compared to Kiss Land is the story that the music videos and the imagery tells about his relationship with music and about the deal that he's actually struck with the entities that be. And I'm going to walk you through each one of these singles and kind of show you how it literally tells the story of him selling his soul or making a deal with the devil that he can't get out of. So for that, let's look at the singles: The Hills, Can't Feel My Face, and Tell a Friend. So the music video for The Hills starts out with The Weeknd getting out of a flipped over car in the middle of a road, literally crawling out of it, but seemingly unfazed and unhurt by it, and he's walking down the road. Two girls get out of the car also and start screaming and yelling at him as if he's the one that caused the accident. Maybe he was driving, but he's just walking away from the crash scene, almost kind of like marching along, like he's being drawn, like he's being led away, not necessarily fazed by the surroundings. This is kind of further reiterated when the car explodes behind him and he doesn't turn around, but the two girls turn around. So he's walking, these two girls are walking, and eventually he arrives at this house. He walks into the house. It's a desolate house. Everything is white, white curtains, white furniture, white floors, and he's kind of looking around a little bit confused, but still trotting along in this marching scene. The music video ends really strangely too, where he goes up these stairs, interestingly enough, kind of ascending, if you will, into a red room where there's the two girls that were walking with him. How did they get there, right? They have different clothes on. They're wearing black clothes. And another guy who looks very, very daunting, very ominous, sitting there with black clothes on as well, as if they had been waiting for him to arrive. And this character, this ominous character in the black clothes, has an apple in his hand. To me, that's a clear nod to the Garden of Eden and the serpent who offered the apple. They offer the apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? To eat this and you will become a god, essentially. So they're sitting there waiting on him. He arrives. They have a stare down. The video ends. So kind of a strange way to shoot a video. There's not a whole lot of storytelling going on. You're kind of just like, what was that about, really? how did it add to the song? Usually for even Belong to the World, the video kind of tells a story, and his previous videos, they're somewhat basic, but they do tell somewhat of a story. This seems to tell no story at all, but really it's just one piece in this entire story that's being told. The next video, Can't Feel My Face, really lends itself to telling that story a little bit more. So Can't Feel My Face was one of The Weeknd's biggest songs, and really is the song that kind of took him from being a star to superstardom, and where he got a lot of comparisons to being the new Michael Jackson, primarily because this song was very pop, very different from stuff that he had done before, and had a very specific sound. It did really well on radio, did really well in streaming services, was featured in a lot of sync placements. Really big song. The music video again tells that story in a different way, but adds another piece that gives the first part a little bit more context. So the video starts out by The Weeknd getting on stage, maybe in an open mic or something like that. He starts performing. The audience is bored. They're not impressed with The Weeknd. They're kind of looking at him, playing with their drinks, almost maybe even a little annoyed by his performance. And that same character from the first music video, The Hills, who I'm gonna just straight up call is the devil, is standing there watching. He lights a cigarette and then he flicks the fire onto The Weeknd. And once he does that, he flicks that fire into The Weeknd bursts into flames. What's interesting is that he bursts into flames, but he doesn't start feeling pain, he doesn't writhe. Instead, he starts performing better. He's dancing all these new dance moves, he's singing on the mic more aggressively. And as he bursts into flames and as the performance increases, he ends up getting the crowd to rise to their feet and start dancing. They start getting into the music. They're really excited about it. They're moving around. They're applauding him. They're like, yeah, this is amazing. The Weeknd is killing it, so to speak, and he's on fire, right? So as he's performing and as the song ends, he walks off stage, and unbeknownst to him, the fire's still on, and he begins to look at himself and say, why is this fire still on me? So the fire never actually leaves him. And obviously in media or just a common phrase in general is when you're doing really well, you're on fire. But this devil character puts him on fire, makes him on fire, makes him start performing. You could probably draw some parallels to like hell or something like that. I don't think that's really the intention. I think it's to say that he gave him his spark and made him on fire and made him this great performer. He got this skill and this ability from somewhere else. Keep in mind also that the song is actually probably about cocaine because he's saying, I can't feel my face when I'm with you, but I love it. So obviously, huge nod to cocaine there. People always say when you try cocaine, you can't feel your face. So really no relationship to that in the visuals of the song at all. No apparent drug use or anything like that. Just him being on stage, this devil character flicking a fire on him and him bursting into flames. Now this leads into the third and final video that came out and I think kind of completes the story. So the final video that came out, the single supporting this album, The Beauty Behind the Madness, is Tell Your Friends. Now Tell Your Friends again features more biblical imagery. So at the first video, The Hills, we saw them holding the apple in kind of a very interesting way, almost as if they were offering it. But in Tell Your Friends, at the very beginning of the video, you see this burning bush. Now if you're familiar with the Bible, you probably heard of the story of Moses, where in Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush is actually the angel of the Lord speaking to Moses and saying, hey, this is what God has planned for you. And I am the Lord, thus saith the Lord. Take off your shoes because you're walking on holy ground. The Weeknd at the beginning walks right by this burning bush as if to ignore it, or maybe he didn't notice it. So he's either ignoring God or he didn't notice God as he's taking this other path. Essentially, the video is the process of him burying someone, trying to kill someone. And the person that he's burying is actually himself. Interestingly enough, the person that he's burying is the one singing the song. So if you look back at the previous video that he was on fire, it looks like he's trying to get rid of that. He's trying to bury that and get out of that. And this person singing, he's just trying to essentially eliminate them and get out of this situation. Of course, per usual, that same devil character shows up, and the Weeknd ends up killing that devil character as well, leaving him in the desert, getting in his car after he's buried himself and driving off. Now in the Christian context, obviously there's this idea of dying to yourself. So if we look at Matthew 16:24, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake will find it. This is a common theme where you die to yourself to serve Christ. Your old person, your sinful person dies, and you're a renewed person in Christ. So the idea that he's trying to kill himself is almost biblical in a way, because he's trying to get rid of this person and become a new person, and even go so far as to kill the person that gave him that fire, that gave him that ability, and that ability to sing and dance and perform and entertain and capture audiences. He kills that devil character who's given him this. So he hops into his car, he drives away. You see the hills in the background, which is interesting, but he leaves that scene, and that's the end of that video, Tell Your Friends. So from the way that the singles are released, it kind of looks like the beginning, the hills, the Weeknd makes a deal with the devil. He goes in that house, makes a deal with the devil. Video 2, Can't Feel My Face. That deal is kind of solidified. He gets put on fire. He kind of realizes maybe he doesn't want this. Video 3, Tell Your Friends. He tries to get rid of himself, that old self that he made the deal with, get out of the deal, and kill the devil. Now that seems to be the story because of how the singles were released. But if you look at the visual cues, they actually tell a much different story. So when we follow the visual cues, what we notice is that Can't Feel My Face is actually the first part of this whole entire engagement. So the first engagement, the Weeknd's performing, the devil flicks a cigarette on him and it lights him up on fire. Then Tell Your Friends is the second video. The reason that we know this is because at the end of Tell Your Friends, the Weeknd drives off in a black car, and at the beginning of the hills, that black car is flipped over in the middle of the street. So really the story that we're being told is that the Weeknd is getting in a car, driving back to the hills, and the car is flipping over where he's stuck in this loop and he can't get out of the deal that he's made with the devil. So again, just to recap that, The Hills is actually the last video in this series telling the story. Can't Feel My Face? Boom. He gets turned on fire. The devil gives him the spark. He's dancing, performing. The crowd's going crazy. Tell Your Friends is the story about him trying to get out of that deal, burying himself while he's still singing, going down a separate path from God to do so, and then trying to shoot and kill the devil. And in that moment, he thinks he has success, heads to the hills, and of course, the hills being that final video where his car is flipped over and he's walking out of it, only to be met again with the devil that he's trying to escape. Whether the Weeknd is telling this intentionally or not, the message is very clear. He is stuck in this deal that he's made with the devil, and there's no getting out of it. Now, what does the Bible tell us about how we look at these different things that we're navigating? Because I'm not criticizing the Weeknd. I'm not saying the Weeknd is this bad guy. Even though he is a puppet, even though he is pushing this agenda, he might be trying to get out of it, and that's what he might be trying to tell us. So the deal that he struck, even if he's fully aware of it, or even if he's not, he's bound by it and he can't get out of it. So when we look in the Bible, this is what we see when we think about really what this conflict looks like, the good versus evil, God versus the devil. Ephesians 6:12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. We're not fighting flesh and blood. We are fighting something we can't see. We're fighting something that has power beyond what we know. We're fighting something that requires a spiritual counter to it. When we're looking to fight the devil, we can't do it with our own two hands. And even in the video, even though the Weeknd's trying to bury himself to get out of this deal, he's trying to kill the devil, he ends up in this loop where he's confronted with it again and again and again because he can't fight it off with himself. Not to mention the devil has been trying to make these deals for a long time. We look at Matthew 4:8, we see it right here with Jesus himself. Again, the devil took him, Jesus, to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. All this I will give you, he said, if you fall down and worship me. Away from me, Satan, Jesus declared, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So the devil's been trying to get people to worship him by giving them things and offering them what he can within his power for a long time. Again, we're not wrestling against flesh, we're wrestling against principalities. So in the same light, it's not that crazy to think that in the music industry, in the film industry, in a lot of industries, the financial industry, the devil is using what he can, what is unseen through his demons and whatever else, to strike these deals with artists and lock them into these contracts where they can't get out and where they've made this deal. Whether that's a recording contract with physical paper and ink, I don't think anyone's pricking their finger and signing with blood necessarily, but these are real life, not only physical, but spiritual binds that are being placed on these artists. Now, with that being said, I'm not going to say that spells are in these songs, but I promise you that committing these songs to memory, committing these melodies to memory, are going to impact your spiritual life in one way, whether you know it or you don't. And I'm sure that that will be a negative way. You might be letting in demons into your life. You might be letting in these principalities and unseen forces into your life simply because you're communicating with them through this music. Now, again, that's not to scare people or go down this conspiracy trail, but the proof is in the pudding. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And the Weeknd is telling us this deal that he's made with the devil, who gave him his ability, who's sustaining his ability, and how he can't get out of that relationship. So of course the story goes on, and this is just part one, but even in his most recent album, Starboy and After Hours, it gets deeper. The satanic imagery, the occultic imagery ramps up even more, becomes more and more blatant, and it might be a point now where the Weeknd is just giving into it. You know, this kind of tells a story in a veiled way, which he maybe was trying to communicate, but looking at some of the stuff I've seen most recently and what we'll get into part two, it might be way past that for him. And obviously we can pray for him and pray that his music and what he does with his life can be one that glorifies God and he can turn and repent. But in that meantime, let's try and be good stewards of what we listen to, what we consume, and take this off of our playlist entirely. Again, I'm FLF. Thank you so much for tuning in to Light Up Babylon. This is part one, part two coming soon. Be sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified when it does come out. Hit the bell to get notifications. Like this, comment this, ask questions. I'm always looking to learn more about what you want to know about and find a way that we can communicate about these different topics. But anyways, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to share this with somebody because it could have a profound impact on their life. God bless.